I don't know about you, but I'm not very good at predicting the future. But there are people who should be good at it because they get paid good money to do it. They get paid good money to be good at predicting the future. Now, as you would be aware, over the last 10 days or so on the east coast of Australia, we've had some very significant weather events and some disastrous weather events in northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland and so on. And the weather forecasters were applying all of their expertise and knowledge and skill to try to predict what would happen in the lead up to those weather events, and yet they didn't get it right. And for example, we had, when it was first affecting southeast Queensland, we had Mrs. Palaget making the comment that after Brisbane got absolutely smashed by the huge amount of rain, she said in this quote, "We never expected this rain." Well, hang on, haven't you got government-sponsored weather forecasters that should have caused us to expect this rain? Now, I'm not trying to denigrate weather forecasters because I have a great deal of respect for them, but it's a very inexact science. And another quote here is that the Queensland storm was like an unpredictable cyclone because the weather forecasters have only got a limited amount of ability to be able to forecast what is going to happen in the future. Well, that's at one end. These are paid people who are paid to forecast what's going to happen in the future. These are also paid people, or people that you might pay money to forecast what's going to happen in the future. Perhaps at the other end of the spectrum in terms of respectability, but nevertheless, people pay good money for psychics and tarot card readers and so on to tell them what their future might contain. Well, there's another category of people that get paid often very handsomely to predict the future, and these are economists. And I rather like this, I don't know whether you can see my little pointer here, I rather like this cartoon because here we have the economist sitting at her desk, of course, pretty much in front of her crystal ball, but the crystal ball is plugged into this magnificent and expensive and very powerful supercomputer to tell the economist what's going to happen in the future. And what she says is, expect the unexpected. And we know that that's the case as well. Economists don't get it right. They get it wrong very often. Case in point, what we've seen here in our own city of Sydney in the last 2 years. If you can see, I don't know whether you can read the date of this particular article, was back in March of 2020. So we're talking 2 years ago from now, just when the COVID-19 pandemic was getting into full swing, and there was this prediction that housing prices around Australia and in Sydney could plummet by 20%. Well, we know what happened. It was the exact opposite. And in fact, during the second half of the pandemic, during 2021, here in Sydney alone, there was a significant period of time when house prices were going up on average $1,000 a day. And of course, the reason it made the news was because A, it was so unpredicted, and B, because it made it so difficult for young people in particular to be able to afford to get into the housing market. But so seeing that so many of the so-called experts can't predict in the very near future in their own areas of specialty, why would we make the seemingly outrageous claim that the Bible that was written thousands of years ago can predict the movements and the outcomes of a major superpower like Russia in 2022, headed up by a man who has proven to be so crafty, so disregarding of world opinion and world leaders and the so-called rule of law? Well, not so-called, that's what most civilised societies are based on, the rule of law. But this man has been so unpredictable that even the political experts are all at odds to try to predict what he is going to do next. And so how could we be so bold to take this very old book, the Bible? What gives us the confidence to say that the Bible can predict Russia's future moves? Well, the first thing that we should be aware of is that the Bible makes a very bold claim about itself. In the second book of Timothy, chapter 3 and verse 16, it says, Paul the writer there says, all scripture is given by inspiration of God. And that's an interesting word, that word inspiration there. It's a Greek word. The New Testament of the Bible was written in Greek, and we read it in English or whatever language we're most familiar with. And in the original Greek, that word there, theopneustos, that's not the correct pronunciation, but nevertheless, the English meaning of that is God-breathed. That the Bible, or rather all scripture, is given by inspiration. It is God-breathed. In other words, God has spoken these words. Well, that's a big claim. Can we test that? How can we test that? Well, indeed we can, and we really should test that, because it is a huge claim. And if we're going to base our entire lives on a book called the Bible, or any other book for that matter, it's a good thing to be able to test whether what it says is actually true. Now, there's a number of ways that this can be tested, whether the Bible really is God-breathed. We're just going to use one of those tonight, and that one method is Bible prophecy, because that's really what we're looking at. There are a number of other ways that we can test its credibility, but that is the one that we're going to use tonight. Now, the Bible has a good track record as far as making predictions and prophecies for the future. And in fact, it is the only holy book. It is the only religious book that really sticks its neck out and makes these concrete, profound predictions about time and people and places and events in the future. It's the only religious book that does that, because if you turn your attention to any number of other so-called religious books, holy writings, claiming to be inspired, whatever that might mean in their context, but nevertheless, when we look at those other holy books, we see books that, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of Hindus' most holy books, and of course the others are obvious, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, both Christian, non-Christian writers. These books have a lot to say about, the type of life that you should live, and developing spiritual values, and being kind, and that sort of thing. But they contain no concrete prophecies or other evidence to give you confidence that that book really is a holy book, a book with a higher authority. And that's really what we're looking for. However, if we push those books aside and we have a look at the Bible, which you can see, in the good old-fashioned black and white printed version, or more commonly today on a screen or on a smartphone. When we have a look at the Bible, what we see in that is a book that is full of specific prophecies, hundreds and hundreds of prophecies in both Old Testament and New, that have been made, that are very specific in their nature and have been fulfilled exactly as the prophet has said. Now, we could spend an entire night, we could spend many nights looking at any number of these particular prophecies. I'm just going to give you one or two examples, and the whole idea of this is to give us some confidence that we're looking at a book that has got a track record, a book that can be trusted. Now, in the Old Testament, there are many, many prophecies that have been fulfilled, and many prophecies that have been made in great detail. This one we just lead off with here. This is a prophecy made in Ezekiel chapter 26. And it's in regard to the destruction of the city of Tyre, as you can see on the screen there. Now, the city of Tyre was a very, very powerful ancient maritime trading city-state. And a prophecy was made by Ezekiel in chapter 26, some 250 years in advance of its fulfilment. So 250 years before Tyre was completely destroyed, Ezekiel made this prediction that it would be destroyed and that it would be such an eradication that he uses the term that it would be like the scraping of the top of a rock in the way that that would be fulfilled. And what we see there is, in fact, obviously the ancient and the modern version of that area in southern Lebanon. And that prophecy came to be fulfilled both in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander the Great, who did exactly what the prophet Ezekiel had said some 250 years before. And part of the prophecy in verse 5 says that she shall be in the midst of the sea, a place for the spreading of nets. That's pretty specific, isn't it? For I have spoken, declares the Lord God. In other words, it's not going to be a major maritime power. It's going to be a place where fishermen dry their nets on the shore. And then we have a picture of exactly what you have there in that little area of southern Lebanon today. A fisherman there who is spreading his nets, and you can see all the fishing craft spread along that shoreline that was artificially created by Alexander the Great when he laid siege to that little island state of Tyre all those years ago. Fascinating, and there's so many other details in that prophecy, but we haven't got time to go into that. That's just one. Let's look at one more. Again in the book of Ezekiel, this time chapter 37, a marvellous, an incredible prophecy about the nation of Israel. A nation that would be subject to being taken into captivity, that it would be dispersed, it would be destroyed as a nation, but then would come again to become a nation in its own land. Again, I love this prophecy and I would love to spend plenty of time on it, but we simply don't have the opportunity for that now because we're just using this as an introduction to give us a reason to believe that what the Bible has to say is true and accurate and reliable. When we turn to the New Testament, we have so many examples of prophecies that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ. 33 specific Old Testament prophecies that were made at least several hundred years before that were fulfilled within the last 24 hours just before Jesus died. Irrefutably accurate to what events took place, words that he spoke, and all sorts of events during just that last 24 hours and through his entire life. Some 350 Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled in Jesus' life. Just one example, probably a really well-known one. The prediction, the prophecy that Jesus, the Messiah, would be born in a tiny little town called Bethlehem, just to the southeast of Jerusalem. In Micah chapter 5 and verse 2, that prediction was made 700 years before the birth of Jesus. 700 years before. To predict that the Messiah, the Saviour, the King of Israel would be born in a tiny little insignificant town would be a little bit like us predicting that the next, say, the most famous ever Prime Minister in the future would be born in the tiniest town in New South Wales, and I looked this up, I think Central Tilba has the moniker for being the smallest town in New South Wales. I don't know whether that's right or not, but you get the idea. Okay, a very significant person to be born in the most insignificant place. That's what Micah did. He made that prophecy, and of course it was fulfilled to the letter. Why? Because it was God-breathed. Again, Jesus himself made many prophecies and predictions for the future, and one of the most amazing was his prediction, his prophecy, that the temple, Herod's temple, one of the 7 wonders of the world, the most significant building in the world of its time, a building that had already been 46 years in construction and would be under construction for another 30 years after the time of Jesus. So it took 76 years to build this building for it to be completed. And what did Jesus say? Well, in Mark chapter 13 and also in Matthew 24, but in Mark 13, I'll just read it to you. It says, this is a wonderful little, just a wonderful little cameo of what took place as Jesus came out of the temple. It says, one of his disciples said to him, and they were so impressed by this amazing building. They said to him, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings," because it was a wonder of their world. And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now that was an incredible prophecy to make. This was the most revered building of its time in the world. It was one of, as I've said a few times already, one of the 7 wonders of the world. And for Jesus to say it was going to be destroyed was just unthinkable for those people. It was only complete for 7 years. In AD 63, that building was finally completed. And some approximately 40 years after Jesus spoke these words, exactly that happened, what he had predicted, that the Romans came in, the Roman army came into Jerusalem, destroyed Jerusalem, completely destroyed this temple, and not one stone was left upon another. And in fact, the ruins of that, there's obviously a little section of the retaining wall, the western wall, which is down in this area here, a small section of that still remains. But as far as the building is concerned, not one stone remains upon another. And there you have, underneath that southwestern corner, the exact evidence of the fulfilment of that prophecy. There you have those stones which were hurled down and came down in the catastrophic destruction of that temple, that smashed to the pavement down here and actually broke the pavement and collapsed it in fulfilment of what Jesus had said there, that not one stone would be left upon another. So that's just, that's something you can observe today and stand there and see the fulfilment of that prophecy that was made so remarkably. Why did we mention all this, and why we could go on and on and on with examples? Well, the reason that we mention it, as we said before, is to demonstrate that the Bible has got a good track record. All right, so, and that's the whole point of this. Because it has an excellent track record, it's made these predictions, it's made these prophecies, it's got form. It's made hundreds and hundreds of detailed, verifiable prophecies that have been made in both Old Testament and New that give the Bible unsurpassed credibility. That when it makes a prophecy for the future, we can have confidence that it will come to pass exactly as predicted based on that track record. Now, there's lots of other ways that we could prove the Bible and give reasons for us to have great confidence in it. We're just going to restrict ourselves to those few examples of Bible prophecy for tonight. So, to get to our subject proper, what does the Bible have to say about Russia and what to expect from her? Well, there is a very specific prophecy in the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, which we've already looked at a couple of times, in Ezekiel chapter 38. And we're going to spend just a little bit of time. We're not going to get too detailed. We're hopefully not going to get too complex. And we're just going to limit ourselves to consider what this book, or rather what this chapter, what this prophecy has to say about Russia. In the book of Ezekiel chapter 38, as you may be aware, the Old Testament, we've said before, the New Testament was written in Greek. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and we read an English or another version that we can understand today. And in the original Greek of, in the original Hebrew in which Ezekiel chapter 38 was written, we have this name that's highlighted there in yellow, the name Rosh. I'm reading to you from the New King James Version of Ezekiel 38. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now, We've got some unusual names there. We've got names that we might not be familiar with. But nevertheless, stay with me and we will work through that. We're not going to get into all those other names. We're just going to look at Rosh. And in case you're thinking, oh, well, you've just picked one translation of the Bible that is suiting you and using that particular word, we look at a few others. The World English Bible also uses that term Rosh because that's what the original word was in the Hebrew. It is transliterated into English as Rosh, Prince of Rosh. Again, in the New American Standard Bible, in the Revised Version, that word Rosh, and there are a number of other translations that translated in the identical way. Now, what is this Rosh? What's this all about? What does it mean? Does it mean anything? Well, for this we turn to some experts. These are not Christadelphians. These are not people with a religious axe to grind. These are experts in their field of words. They're lexicographers. They are expert students in the ancient language. And the first one that we have a look at is a gentleman that lived a long time ago, but was regarded and still is as one of the greatest scholars of the Hebrew language. You can see the dates there that he lived. And he says, speaking about this little passage here in Ezekiel chapter 38, he says that the Rosh there is, he unquestionably believed that the Rosh in Ezekiel 38 was a proper noun. It was a name identifying Russia. And you can see down there in the bottom paragraph that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is talking about a northern nation mentioned with Meshech and Tubal, undoubtedly the Russians, who were mentioned by the Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name Ros, dwelling to the north of Taurus as dwelling on the river Ra, in brackets Volga, or Volga as we would know it today. So just to give you a little bit of geography in that regard, hope it's not too small to see there, but you can see an area here. We've got Turkey, we've got Eastern Europe and up into Russia here. And the area that he's talking about when it says that it's to the north of the Taurus, just be aware that today we have the Taurus Mountains, which are in southern Turkey. That's not what it's talking about. The ancient name for the Crimean Peninsula was Tauri or Taurus, and that's what he's referring to. So the Crimean Peninsula, he says, is what they were to the north of on the river Ra, which is, and this is, you will not be able to read that, but you'll have to take my word for it, that down here in Wikipedia, good old Wikipedia, talking about the river Volga, says that Ra was the ancient name for that river Volga. Here it is, the river Volga runs through here, the pin is pointing to a section of it. The Volga, the longest river in Europe. This is the area that Gesenius is saying to the north of the Taurus, to the north of Crimea, which is the area where the world is focused on at the moment, the area of Ukraine, approximating where the Volga River, the longest river in Europe, runs through. That is where this Rosh is referring to. Well, we don't have to rely on just Gesenius. We have any number of other experts. We have a Dr. Kyle, who is also well known, would be well known to many in the audience here, not personally, obviously, but through his writings. And after a careful grammatical analysis, he says that Rosh, that the Byzantine and Arabic writers frequently mention a people called Rus or Ros, it's exactly the same, dwelling in the country of Taurus. We've already explained what that means, and reckoned among the Scythian tribes, which is up in that area of Russia. Samuel Bocart down here, also quite an old writer, but well regarded, in his book called Sacred Geography, declares that Ros is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name Russia. So we've got a little bit of evidence from a few of these writers here. They're quite old. They're well and truly deceased, and you might think, well, you know, does anyone today believe the same thing? That this Rosh of Ezekiel 38 is an ancient mention, or rather an ancient terminology for Russia? Well, here's a more modern writer. This gentleman by the name of Clyde Billington, just in last century, well, which is quite close, describes exactly the same thing, and he says that The Rosh people of Ezekiel 38 and 39 were the ancestors of the Rus or Ross people of Europe and Asia. He says it down again further, the Rus and Ross, and finally here the Rosh people of the area north of the Black Sea formed the people known today as the Russians. Now you might be thinking, well, that's all very well and good. You've picked out a few writers that agree with your point of view, and you can make it say anything you want. Well, you are entitled to think that. But let me give you one more example of a modern writer who has come to the exact same conclusion. A modern writer who's been very much in the news of late. And it would be this gentleman whose face we are all familiar with. In the middle of last year, Vladimir Putin wrote an article, or rather an essay, that was in July of last year. And this was in preparation, or as part of his effort to convince the world that the Ukraine really was part of Russia. That's his whole premise around this invasion, that the Ukraine and the Russians are one people, and it's the artificial barrier that has been created between the two shouldn't be there, and that they really should all be under the Russian umbrella. Now, in this particular article, he starts off and he says, during a recent discussion, he said, I was asked about the Russian-Ukraine relations. I said that Russia and Ukraine were one people. And so he goes through this whole essay to prove that. When we come down just a few paragraphs, down to about the fourth paragraph, we read something interesting. Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus. Same word. Same language, same understanding. The throne of Kiev, which of course is being bombarded as we speak, held a dominant position in ancient Rus. And then later, like other European states of that time, ancient Rus faced a decline. And he uses this terminology right throughout his article to prove that Rus is the most ancient way under which the nation of Russia should and can be understood. So if you don't believe me, and if you're a little sceptical about some of the lexicographers and the experts, well, even Vladimir Putin believes exactly the same thing. Has Vladimir Putin been reading Ezekiel chapter 38? Perhaps, I doubt it, but perhaps. But there is no doubt that he sees the derivation of the ancient name for Russia exactly the same as other independent and prominent scholars and lexicographers. And he's using that historical connection to justify his move into the Ukraine. So what exactly does Ezekiel 38 predict for this Rus or Rosh and her allies? Well, here's a map of the area, and as you can see, it is very red. If you're a visual person, as I am, this coloured map might be a little helpful in explaining to you what the prophet Ezekiel has to say about the movement of this Rosh, or Rus, or Ross. It's all exactly the same identity in terms of what's going to happen in the future. And what I'm going to do is read to you the first 9 verses of this chapter, the first 9 verses of this prophecy. And just as I read that, just cast your eyes over the map. You will see some names there that you are, of places that you're quite familiar with: Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, Persia, which of course is the more ancient name for the area of Iran. But there are names there that you will not be familiar with. But let's just read that and just get an idea for what Ezekiel is saying about this Rosh and what is going to happen in relation to these other countries that are mentioned. So I'll read to you from the New King James Version. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and put hooks in your jaws and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya are with them, all of them with helmet and with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his troops, the house of Togarmah from the far north and all its troops. Many people are with you. Prepare yourself and be ready, you and all your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you will be visited. In the latter years you will come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which hath long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations. Remember what we said a little earlier, one of those prophecies? Here's another one. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. You will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops and many peoples with you. So, the prophet tells us that the intent of this Rosh and all those with her is not just the Ukraine, which is this area here, or the rest of Eastern Europe, or all of Europe for that matter, but in fact the ultimate intent of this confederation under this Rosh is to come down into the Middle East to the little nation of Israel. That Israel is going to be the ultimate target. That seems unlikely, you might be thinking. Pretty unlikely, can't see that happening. Perhaps it does seem unlikely. But if you watch any of the news bulletins, as I did, of interviews with Ukrainian people who were saying just one day before Vladimir Putin invaded the Ukraine, they thought it incredibly unlikely that he would invade. They were absolutely shocked when he did. They thought it was unlikely. It was also very unlikely that some significant world events like the collapse of the Soviet Union, or indeed the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain in 1989, those seemed like incredibly unlikely events to happen, and yet they did happen, and they happened very quickly. Very quickly. I'll just spend a moment just explaining, for example, the Berlin Wall. Now, for many in the audience here, you weren't even born when that happened in 1989. But in 1989, which is not that long ago in my perspective, Russia's iron grip over Eastern Europe would vanish basically in 15 minutes. On the 9th of November 1989, people in East Germany and in East Berlin woke up to what seemed like any other ordinary day. And on that evening, a whole bunch of reporters were called to a rather unremarkable hall in East Berlin for a news conference by the main spokesman for the East German government. Now, that wasn't anything unusual. They were, very good at putting out propaganda. There had been some talk about a little bit of liberalisation of the East German situation, but nothing dramatic, and no one was expecting anything dramatic to happen on that evening. So they all bustle into this hall and fussing about trying to find a place to sit or stand and had no idea that within a few minutes the world would be completely convulsed. And shortly after 7 p.m. that night, the East German spokesman, Gunther Schabowski, came bustling in. He sat down in front of all the microphones and he started to explain a little bit about how that they were going, that the East German Politburo had made some decisions that they would liberalise things very, very slightly. And he talked for a while about the regime's new approach. And then there was this awkward pause because he'd lost the most critical piece of paper that he was looking for, which was the very thing that he called them there to tell them tonight. So eventually, with a bit of help of one of his assistants, he finds that bit of paper. And he says to them, "This will be interesting for you." He was a bit rattled by this stage because he'd lost his bit of paper for such a while. He says, "Today it was decided to make it possible for all citizens to leave the country through the official border crossing points. All citizens of the German Democratic Republic can now be issued with visas for the purposes of travel or visiting relatives in the West. This order is to take effect at once. And he used the German word, now forgive me if I get this wrong, the pronunciation will be very poor, but the German word that he used was unverzüglich, a 4-syllable German word, unverzüglich. Means immediately. And everyone started talking, well, what does this mean? And so a correspondent from an East German radio station called out and he said, well, what exactly does unverzüglich mean in this context? And without really thinking, Mr. Schabowski says, well, it just means straight away. Now, what the Central Committee had actually decided was that anyone wanting to visit the West could now apply for a visa, and then that would go through all the bureaucratic protocols, and then very gradually a little trickle of people would be allowed to visit the West. It was intended to be a very slow process, but he gave an entirely different impression to that press conference that night. And the large number of East Berliners that were watching it live on television assumed that he meant they could just head for the wall and go straight across, and that's exactly what they did. And the guards on the gates had not been given instructions to shoot, which they sometimes were, so they didn't, and they let them go through. And within 15 minutes from that declaration of that press conference, you had scenes like that. The world changed in 15 minutes because of a misunderstanding of a 4-syllable German word, unverzüglich. And the reason that I like that story and I've presented that is to show that the world can and does change very quickly in the face of what might seem to be very, very unlikely circumstances. And ladies and gentlemen, you can be sure that there will be further very dramatic changes, and they may be very rapid and they may take effect in a very short space of time. I mean, the Ukrainians discovered that 10 days ago, didn't they? Dramatic, unexpected change. The people of the Crimean Peninsula discovered that 8 years ago when Russia just went in and took over. The Berliners discovered that in 1989. The world discovered it in 2001 when the World Trade Center Twin Towers were flown into. Things can happen quickly and unexpectedly. And even the Bible talks about exactly that phenomena. In 1 Thessalonians 5, Paul says, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord," this is talking about the return of Jesus Christ, which is the ultimate end in this whole scenario, "that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as a woman, as travail upon a woman with child." Now, a thief doesn't announce his intentions via a phone call or a social media post, does he? It's stealthy, it's quiet, and it's quick. But then sudden change, whatever the intentions of that thief were, sudden change will happen, and it happens very, very swiftly. So, to be clear, the prediction of the Bible is that Russia will make, with this confederacy of nations that Ezekiel 38 talks about, will make a move from the north that will consolidate Europe and parts of the Middle East and Northern Africa and will invade Israel. Unlikely? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it is hard to see such a major event happening in the context of the world today. But no, I don't think it's hard to see that, because major events do happen unexpectedly. And no, it's not hard to believe that it will happen, because the Bible predicted it, and the Bible has track record. It has form when it comes to its prophecies. The more sure word of prophecy has said that it will happen. And it will, ladies and gentlemen. So even though we might think that it's unlikely that Russia will progress beyond its foray into the Ukraine and Crimea, other people don't see it as contained as that. Let me just show you this little clip. This is from the SBS World News just on Friday night. And this is a little clip where first of all, obviously, Mr. Putin appears on there, but then the president of the Ukraine comes on and says, what he thinks is Putin's ultimate intentions, not just with the Ukraine but beyond. Just have a listen. Hopefully the audio will come through okay and we'll start that off.
Dear comrades, I want to say that the special military operation is going strictly in accordance with schedule, according to the plan. All the goals are being successfully achieved.
But from a bunker in Kyiv, Ukraine's president warning of the true extent of Putin's goals.
God forbid, if we are no more, then Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia will be next. Then Moldova, Georgia, Poland, and so on. They will march to the Berlin Wall. Believe me.
Did you hear those last words that he said? They will march to the Berlin Wall. Believe me. Now, of course, Mr. Zelensky is speaking with a heightened sense of anxiety, speaking with a degree of hyperbole perhaps. But what he's saying is that don't think they're just going to stop here. They're not going to be satisfied just with Ukraine. And he uses the names of all of those surrounding nations. And he says they'll march to the Berlin Wall. Well, perhaps I would suggest to you that even the Ukrainian president underestimates them, because the Bible says they will go beyond that. They will confederate those nations, whether by force or whether by coercion or whether by friendship. We're not entirely sure, nor are we told, and so we don't speculate on that. But what we do know is that the Bible says that they will be confederate, they will come down into Israel, but that Jesus Christ will stop the advance of Russia and her allies on the mountains of Israel. He will defeat Russia when it drives down through Europe and into the Middle East. And it will be defeated on the mountains of Israel. Now, you know, ladies and gentlemen, that what we're saying here, you might think, oh, well, you Christadelphians have jumped on to the bandwagon, you can see these things happening, and you're sort of reinterpreting the Bible according to what you see happening in the world around you at the moment. Well, you know, what we're saying here is not a new thing. I have a book here with me which I've owned for a long time. I first received this book and first read this book about 45 years ago. And in this book, in the preface of this book, which is a book that is very greatly devoted to some of the things that we're saying tonight in terms of Bible prophecy and the way that these things should be understood. In this book that was written not 45 years ago, but about 170 years ago, in 1848, this book was written by a gentleman by the name of John Thomas, one of the early Christadelphians, one of the early members of our faith. And in this book, in the preface, he says, in relation to these exact same things that we've been talking about tonight, the future movements of Russia are notable signs of the times because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. We'll skip the middle paragraph that appears on your screen there just for simplicity and brevity tonight. And we come to that third paragraph. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. So, ladies and gentlemen, this writer, based on his understanding of these things that we've been talking about, Ezekiel chapter 38 and many, many other prophecies in the Bible, came to the conclusion that we should be watching Russia and her future moves. The future movements of Russia are notable signs of the time because they are predicted in the scriptures of truth. And that's what gives us the boldness, the temerity to invite you to a presentation tonight, to be able to give you certainty about these things because of what the Bible has to say. And so for some 170 years, Christadelphians have been saying exactly the same thing. We haven't jumped onto a bandwagon. We have believed these things for a long time because that's what the Bible, the book with the track record, says. It speaks about the movements of Russia. It speaks about how that confederacy of nations will come down into Israel. But they will not be successful ultimately because the return of Jesus Christ will intervene and will put a stop to those advances. And the question that we ask for ourselves tonight, we ask you, I ask myself, are we ready for the return of Jesus Christ? There are so many signs that it is so close. We've looked at Russia's moves. There are many other signs that the Bible talks about in Bible prophecy. And here, Jesus, in one of the prophecies that he made, it talks about exactly these things. And he's talking about here the nation of Israel and of Jerusalem. And he says, as a prophecy, as a prediction, they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. That was his beloved nation Israel. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. He says there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and on earth distress of nations with perplexity. He's using some metaphorical language, but he's talking about the powers in the world and all of the unrest that we see. The sea and the waves roaring. It's an excellent metaphor for what we're seeing in the world today. Men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And then he goes on in the very next verse and he says, don't wait until all these things are done and dusted. Don't wait until it's all so obvious and it's finished. He says, when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draws nigh. And that's where we're at tonight, brothers and sisters. These things are beginning to come to pass. We don't know exactly how those things are going to transpire over coming days or months, but we do know the ultimate end, and we've given you the broad brush version of that tonight. That Russia and her allies will be defeated in Israel. Make no mistake about that. There's an interesting prophecy that was made in the Old Testament in Micah chapter 4, verses 1 to 7, but in particular verses 3 to 4, speaking of this time of the future when Jesus Christ shall return. And it says, he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off. And he says, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. None shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. And that's speaking of that time of wonder, of the future, that time that we look forward to, when men shall beat their swords into plowshares. You know, ladies and gentlemen, that statue that you see depicted there on the right-hand side of the screen, my wife and I had the privilege of seeing that about 6 years ago. That statue sits in the grounds of the United Nations building in New York on the East River in the city of New York. And that statue was given to the United Nations as a gift by the nation of Russia in 1959. You might not be able to, you probably won't be able to read, but at the base of that statue, which I think is incredibly significant, of course it's a statue of a man beating a sword into a ploughshare. And at the base of that statue, the Russians have inscribed, "We shall beat our swords into ploughshares." I wonder if they knew how true that will be. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and they will be defeated on the nation, on the mountains of Israel, as Ezekiel and many other prophecies have said. The Russians and all countries, all nations who would oppose the Lord Jesus Christ will beat their swords into plowshares. There will be no more war. There will be no more need for swords, of course, being a symbol of warfare. Because the world will be a world of peace. And there are many, many other prophecies about this wonderful future that has been promised, of world peace and prosperity and equity and justice when Jesus Christ returns to establish God's kingdom on the earth. And there's just a very small selection of them there. We'd love to speak with you about those, and we could spend hours and hours looking at those in great detail. But finally, we come to the very last part of our title for tonight. Russia's future moves predicted in the Bible, what it means for you. Well, I guess you've already started to see the answer to this. Hopefully, we've shown you that the Bible is a reliable, trustworthy guidebook for life. It has a proven track record. It's got form. It has predicted accurately hundreds of events in the past. And we can have great confidence based on that and other reasons that its predictions for the future will also come true. Yes, it does predict a time of trouble associated with Russia's moves into Ukraine and beyond. But beyond that, it promises a time of peace and prosperity and justice and safety to eliminate once and for all the strife and turmoil and war and disease and suffering and death that is our lot at the moment in this world. And in a moment, we're just going to conclude with a very short video of exactly what that, well, not exactly, but a representation of what that might look like. It promises the return of Jesus Christ to establish God's kingdom on the earth, to bring about all of those wonderful promises to fruition. And it promises for you and your family a place in that kingdom, that time of great joy and rejoicing forevermore, if you choose to follow him now. And so we ask you to please take these matters seriously. Please consider the eternal well-being, the welfare of your family and yourself. Choose Christ, choose truth, and this promise of the future can be yours. And so to finish, without any further comment from me, I'd like to show you a little presentation, a graphic illustration, just only goes for 1 or 2 minutes, a graphic illustration of one of my favourite chapters in the Bible, a really positive way to finish our presentation tonight. Isaiah chapter 35. It's a cameo of that wonderful time of the future that can be yours if you choose it. A time when, as that chapter concludes, and as you'll see at the end of the presentation, a time when sorrow and sighing shall flee away.